you kind of have to have data at your fingertips. You have to have, the infrastructure set up to enable you to do it. And that takes a lot of time. Like finance people definitely need to think about what actually moves the needle here. How can you invest the time up front to build this architecture so that going forward it doesn't take a huge amount of time?
Welcome to the Money at Work podcast. I'm very excited to have here Robbie, who is leading finance at Humaans. Hi, Robbie. It's a good friend of mine as well. Really nice to see you. I know we haven't been able to catch up for a long time. How are you doing today?
Oh, good, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
Tell us more about Humaans, your background, your role, and please share more about you.
Yeah, so I joined Humaans, a Series A startup. We're a B2B SaaS company. We make a HRIS, so it's a people management software. Since we're talking about finance, the analogy I usually use to describe it is your accounting software is to finance, Humaans is to HR. So it's the source of all your data, it's how you manage your people data, and then it's ultimately the insights and the processes and the value that you get out of it. So joined Humaans as the first finance hire, as most people who've worked in a early stage company can probably appreciate, wear many hats. My background prior to Humaans was much more in the kind of the data and the analytics space. So it was really nice getting to bring that perspective into Humaans and building some of the reporting infrastructure from the ground up, as well as kind of owning all things finance, the fun parts around the insights, the more gruesome parts around the APAR and everything else, but the really important bits that are required to run any organization. So being here a year and a half, learned a ton. Probably appreciate now, having been here so long, how much I didn't know when I joined. But it's been a really exciting journey with them so far, and I'm definitely looking forward to the future.
Yeah, no, Robbie, it's the same as even myself as a founder. There's always this saying, right? I would love to just go back in time with everything I learned and then redo it again. And I bet it's the same probably for you. One of the unique aspects of your background, Robbie, is that you have a technical background, right? You a bit of a data scientist, technical side. That's one of your unique specialities. Would that be fair? And how did that shape?
I suppose if I'm sitting next to an engineer, I'd never describe myself as overly technical. But if I'm sitting next to anybody else, I suppose it is fair to say that I am. A lot of my background probably is in the kind of the ETL space, the kind of the data architecture setup. So, tools like SQL, very comfortable in, or Python, pretty comfortable in. I guess coming from a consulting background, one of the benefits of that is you're exposed to a lot of different clients and customers, some who are very sophisticated, some who are not as sophisticated, some who are looking for a quick and dirty solution, some who are looking for a best-in-class solution. No wrong answers, but just everybody's different. So I guess when it comes to my technical skill set, I describe it more as being very comfortable with ambiguity, being very comfortable picking up new tools, trying to ultimately get organizations from 0 to 1 in a lot of cases. But it definitely is fair to describe me as technical.
No, I know. Don't get me wrong. It's so funny when you say that. Where if I'm next to an engineer, probably I'm like, no. But maybe next to a finance person, you can say, well, I can at least defend myself with some of the classic financial model stack or ETL or pipeline data pipelines as well. How would you define then these new world of finance where I think knowing SQL, Python, sometimes maybe even R, where you want to use different data sets or sources to understand your cash, I guess. How do you think it has evolved and changed in the last couple of years? And also would love to know, what are you using? I know you, I remember you when we were chatting last year, you have this diagram that I bet you're very proud of, where you have all the data goes into this ETL, and then from then on you send it to other places. So I would love to hear more.
Yeah, no, two really good questions. I suppose first of all, in terms of maybe the reason, or at least my interaction with how finance has kind of gone more digital, and the reason I'm kind of quite excited by that. A lot of my time over the last year and a half, and even today, and I don't see it changing anytime, is kind of split between two different dimensions. One is, how can you spend as much of your time, focus, and just mental energy on the things that actually move the business forward? And so things like, having conversations around really understanding your channels, your pipeline, your sales, your closing, your costs, your investment in an area versus the rate of return that you get, different scenarios that you're trying to balance. And the way I kind of sum all of that up into maybe one neat thought is it's ultimately about running experiments and then reacting based on those experiments. So it literally is as simple as, you come up with a hypothesis, you sort of think, well, what if we tripled our advertising spend over the next quarter? What results do we think would happen? The best thing to do is to kind of sit down, look at your historical data, try to map that out and understand how the inputs ultimately flow through a process and lead to outputs. Of course, you never know. And as you kind of alluded to earlier, things change so frequently. You'd love to go back with the knowledge you had, but by the time you start all over again, things have probably changed. So it's about setting a framework for how to make decisions. And I think that's ultimately where the intersection of kind of finance, reporting, and digital all comes together because, hopefully we are the people who have the best insight across the whole business. We obviously have the main visibility and ownership over costs, but we also, get to hopefully support sales, marketing, advertising, growth, even product and customer success to some degree as well. So I think that's really exciting. But in order to be able to do that, it kind of comes to the other side of the coin, which is, well, like everyone's day is finite. There's only so many hours in the day, and we'd love to spend all our time doing this. But in order to do that, you kind of have to have data at your fingertips. You have to have, the infrastructure set up to enable you to do it. And that takes a lot of time. So I think the other side of the coin is, how can you automate away the bits that typically can be very cumbersome or the bits that can take up a lot of your time? Or the flip side is, how can you invest the time up front to build this architecture so that going forward it doesn't take a huge amount of time? I think I remember one of the earliest things I was asked by our CEO to do was essentially pull a report based on some kind of ideas that he had in his head, pull the data together, do a bit of analysis, explore it, and come up with a path forward. But I remember kind of having a conversation with him pretty early on, which was, I can pull this data for you pretty quickly. It'll probably take an hour or two. But the problem is if you ask me to do it again in a week's time, it's still going to take me an hour or two. I'm going to have to do it all over again. So if you give me a week or you give me a few days, I can build something that means if you ask me again, it'll take 5 minutes. And the benefit of that is, especially when you're running these experiments, you want to kind of keep track of your progress over time. You want to be able to look back and say, okay, well, over this month or over this quarter, this is how we did. Whereas, looking back now over the kind of the most recent one, this is the comparison and this is how the trend is looking. So those are probably two of the big kind of principles, I suppose, that I would try to structure my day, structure my week, structure my month around. Is I'm either doing the bits that need to be done, or I'm trying to automate them or improve them or build an architecture that will take that capacity off my plate in the future.
Yeah, this is very fascinating because product engineering is very similar as well. So let's say we have a bug from a customer and we can just fix the bug, meaning it could take maybe 1 hour or an hour and a half of an engineer to fix it. But then there's this question of when should we try to have a feature or an admin tool or a process that allows the customer support to then fix that problem instead of having the engineering, whoever's on support, trying to do that. So that you have to always be balancing between, time, cost, and effort.
Yeah, for sure.
When you have a finance team that is sometimes small, I know you were the first one the first hire, right? And then you had to set up all these architecture. How do you balance, in this framework to say, this is worth it to create the new framework and the new structure versus I'll do this one off and it's completely okay? Do you do it by value, by what the CEO needs, by the company needs, by the board needs?
Yeah, navigating that in practice is really tough. And I think one of the things you learn pretty quickly is that it's not binary. Like, you're never done. As soon as you start investing in an architecture, all the ways that you might want to improve it only become evident. And that's tough because you have to be very disciplined. And this is how much time I can invest in this now, and this will get me to here. But then be willing to kind of put it in the back burner or walk away for a little while later before you just completely, try to over-engineer a solution or over-optimize something that's good enough. And that's probably one of the principles that I kind of look at. It's like, okay, oftentimes the difference between not having anything in place versus having just something that's pretty decent is so big. And the difference between something that's kind of pretty decent and really, really good is probably not as big. So it's a little bit of kind of looking across the board and trying to look at, end to end, everything that we touch and sort of say, okay, you know, which are the bits here that I need to start with, which are the bits that can wait longer. And you usually know, like there usually are, I don't like to say that there are fires burning, but there are fires sometimes that are burning and you need to go put out that fire. And sometimes there's fires that are not quite bouldering, not quite burning, or maybe are just smoldering a little bit away in the background. And those are the bits that you kind of say, okay, actually, we can leave that for another week or two. But I think as I think about the evolution of humans on a kind of a wider time frame or take a broader lens, the big difference for me is that ultimately, I suppose I'm the one who's probably setting up a lot of these processes, and I'm kind of going for, I won't say I'm going for breadth over depth, but relative to where I think humans is going to get to in the next few years, I definitely am. And ultimately, it'll be about bringing on more people who can start to own different areas, and they can really start to add the depth to it. And hopefully that depth isn't just depth in terms of volume, it's also depth in terms of sophistication too. But of course, again, the needs of the business are constantly changing. So it's a difficult one to manage. And you also touched on the kind of the parallel to engineering, which I think is quite interesting, because one of the things that can happen, particularly when you're building these things or you're working with data, that's quite different to maybe some of the traditional finance stuff is oftentimes you can sit down to try and build something. And maybe just to use a specific example, although it is broad, if you're trying to extract data from your CRM, merge it with some of your billing data, pull it into your data warehouse, build a kind of a table or a view, and then just sit a dashboard on top of it. If you're trying to do that, sometimes you just physically don't know how long it's going to take, because you can write code and it just isn't working. And you're kind of sitting there going, oh God, I've just invested 2 hours into this and all I have is code that doesn't work. I'm still at zero, which of course isn't quite true in reality, but it's the way it feels. Sometimes there's comfort to kind of just say, oh, I'll just throw it into a Google Sheet. I know how to work with it. I'll do a pivot table. I'll kind of do an index match and I'll be able to get it done in 2 hours. And sometimes it's knowing the difference between what is required in that moment. Is it worth the investment? Is it not worth the investment? But it definitely can be frustrating sitting down and being like, I'm going to do this analysis. And ultimately it ends up taking a hell of a lot longer than you ever thought, which has a huge knock on. But anyway, that's just the reality of the situation, I guess.
No, I know. It's the same as building product, right? It's exactly the same as, how sometimes we think about, should we take the path of quality, and that's the depth, or the path of fast delivery, but maybe it won't have the same level of robustness when we're building a feature. If you were doing the architecture again, so let's say you were joining Humans again today, what would you do differently and why? Would you change anything? Would you look back and be like, oh yes, I would have done things in a different way?
I think there's always things you would do differently, but as a broad feeling, I'm definitely reasonably happy that with what we've built, which I think is a good position to be in. I kind of think about it as the overall principles that we built the architecture with shouldn't really change, because I think we did a good job of thinking them through. The overall structure of how we built the architecture won't change. And maybe just to add a little bit of flavor to that, generally what we have is we've got a kind of a 3-level architecture. We've got our input systems, which is where all of your kind of underlying data lives. And that could be your CRM, it could be your billing, it could be your accounting software, obviously is going to be a big one, could be your HRIS. And there could be other ones in there depending on the nature of your business. But they're kind of the bits that as finance, we don't necessarily own what goes in there, but we're maybe the custodians of it. We're the ones who are kind of looking for data quality, trying to flag issues, but it's really the business itself who's kind of putting the data in and managing those systems. Where we kind of come in is more the middle layer, where we're pulling the data out of those systems, because we're the ones who want to consume that, or who want to understand what's in there, who want to run insights off of it. And then finally, you've got your third level, which is kind of like your output layer. And it's how do we consume that? Or maybe it's not even just us consuming it. It's how does the business consume the insights that we've created? And that could be as simple as putting it into a PowerPoint slide deck. It could be having like self-service dashboards that the business can look at. It could be modeling and kind of forecasting tools. It could be any number of things. So broadly speaking, there's a lot of principles in that I think work quite well. It's the idea of ownership. It's the idea of single source of truth. It's the idea of aggregating different data across different sources and pulling it into one succinct view. But it's constantly changing. And I also think one of the things that we were conscious of from the beginning is there could come a world in the not too distant future where every individual tool in that architecture has been replaced with something else. But yet the way we think of the architecture hasn't changed. Like we could easily upgrade our CRM. We'll never upgrade our HRIS, obviously, but a business could. We might upgrade our billing system. We might introduce more things. We might upgrade our accounting software, but it'll still be the same conceptual flow in theory. It'll be the data lives there. It's coming into an aggregated place. It's being pushed to our data warehouse, and then we're connecting different tools to that to use in different ways. So I probably have just given a long-winded answer that says there's nothing I would change. There definitely are bits for sure. I think one thing that kind of, it's kind of a natural sprawl, but definitely this year, some of the things I'd like to do better, or at least improve on in the architecture, is get much better process documentation. It's kind of a painful one that gets skipped over so much, but I guess, so much of it kind of lives in our own heads. That's a little bit of a risk of if people were to leave the business or if something was to fundamentally change, I'd love to feel a bit more secure about that. The other thing as well is, when you're kind of our data warehouse, when you're kind of writing queries all the time in different tables, do we have good documentation as to what's in there and why? And almost like the idea of data definitions, a lot of it is kind of in our heads or it's in the queries themselves, but it's not easy for somebody to kind of come along and understand exactly why we did the things the way we did. But again, there's plenty of time to fix these things, and there's a million other things that come to mind of where we'd like to focus. And that's the benefit of getting to kind of do this over time, I guess.
I think one of the things that you did and Humans did very well is to have these data warehouse where you push all the stuff, and then because it's clean, better data, then you can push it somewhere else.
Yeah. And actually, just to expand on that a little bit, which I think is something I would recommend to people, we have a data warehouse that engineering owns, and that's where a lot of our kind of product data lives. It's obviously where a lot of our customer data lives, and the business don't have access to that or don't have visibility over that, which they shouldn't anyway, especially from kind of data security and that type of thing. There's no reason for us to interact with that. But we actually have our own data warehouse, which is more like the kind of it's everybody other than product, which is where all of this type of stuff sits. And that's a good way of setting it up so that you're protecting what needs to be protected. You're able to control access in a kind of sensible way, but you also have the playground of being able to push whatever data you think you need in whatever level of granularity or in whatever structure you think you need into somewhere, and then ultimately pull it from it. And that's a principle I think is really, really important. I think there definitely are plenty of finance teams out there who are doing that. I think there's probably ops teams out there who are as well. But if that's something that somebody wasn't doing, it's definitely something I would encourage teams to think about.
Perfect. Yeah, that is something that I found it very unique when we met last year, because not a lot of teams do this. Okay, so let's go back into more of let's say some of the audience are YC founders. They build a SaaS product. They have a couple of customers. They hire the first finance team. What do you think are the key KPIs that finance teams should be tracking in terms of the business at the very beginning?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think particularly in an early stage company, and I mean this with hopefully all the best intention in the world, I actually mean this more to finance people out there than I mean it to founders, is yeah, you definitely want to elevate what the company are doing for sure, but you don't want to come in and sort of, particularly if you're coming from maybe a bigger company or a more sophisticated company, you don't necessarily need to come in and sort of put on a finance hat and think about the world purely from a finance perspective. A lot of small companies and growing companies who have great growth ambitions are kind of balancing this long-term ambition against survival mode in the short term. And ultimately, I think CEOs generally are pretty good for thinking this way, but finance people definitely need to think about what actually moves the needle here. How can we ultimately make better decisions as a business? And that is the kind of the yardstick, I think, by which everything should be measured. It's not necessarily things sorry, don't get me wrong. Payroll accuracy is still super important. Cash collection is still super important. cash forecasting, super important. Payables, making sure you're paying your suppliers on time. Those things definitely matter. VAT returns. There's a ton of compliance stuff that is very, very important and would leave a bad taste in people's mouths if not done correctly. But there's also, there's probably a temptation to start jumping into, analysis like what's our EBITDA, what's our gross margin, what's our kind of, all of these things. And like that, it's good to have those. It's good to understand them. Educating the business and elevating the financial literacy across the company is really important. Don't get me wrong. But most companies have a North Star metric and everything kind of flows from that. For us, it was ARR, and ARR then being broken down into new ARR, contraction or expansion or churn, and just understanding even the world through that lens. It's like, how does everything as a business that we do contribute to that? And of course, then finance, as the first finance hire, you're probably going to be putting structures in place to think about, okay, that's still our North Star. How's our investment across the different businesses powering those things or not powering those things in the correct way? So my kind of advice is definitely for finance people, try to elevate the business, try to bring a new perspective, but don't lose sight, particularly in the early days, of like how simple an equation it really is. It's what moves the needle or what doesn't. I guess then as founders, maybe the opposite, or at least maybe looking at it from a slightly different perspective, it's in order to be aware of how the inputs affect the outputs, you do need to be thinking of the world through cost and investment. That's definitely kind of important. I think as well, understanding, this is a big challenge for organizations of all sizes, is how do you actually consume the insights? Like it's great to like build a million dashboards and have a million different data points in a million different formats, but it's very hard to actually consume that and kind of take action on it. And that's still something I think that every business, ourselves included, is constantly trying to improve on. How are you actually taking decisions based on this stuff? So as founders, try to ask the right questions and try to be conscious of, is this the type of question that you're going to want to ask multiple times? And if so, allow the teams the time it might take to clean this stuff up. There's also cleaning this stuff up is a good point to raise as well. Like, you're only as good as the quality of the data. You could build this amazing architecture and have all this data at your fingertips. And if ultimately there isn't good discipline across the organization of how you're actually putting the input information into these systems, you'll miss the wood from the trees. So that's extremely important as well. So lots of different themes I suppose I've touched on briefly there, but a lot of this stuff is intuitive, like you kind of know, but it's just about having the right perspectives in the room and then taking the right decisions as a business. And it comes back to the same point I raised earlier around experiments, thinking of the world that way. What are your hypotheses? What do you think will happen if you do something? And having the framework to actually self-correct if you're either right or if you're wrong about that hypothesis.
I still find it so fascinating because I hear your answers, and also when we talk to other great finance leaders, and there's such a close way of thinking from an engineering and product perspective. A junior engineer, the reason why is a junior engineer is because you have to give them so much direction on what they're going to build, versus a senior engineer is thinking more, okay, what are we trying to solve? Yeah. Why does this matter? What's the problem? And then you step back and then you understand that the actual thing you want to build maybe is not what the PM ever told you or what the customer is exactly saying to you, is other aspects of it. So I find that very fascinating because it's just what you're mentioning, right? If the David or Phil joining the company would have come to me and say, hey, we need to do a beta, blah, blah, I'd be like, guys, we need to first understand why, because customers are paying us. What's the revenue? What's the AR? And then we need to understand the cost. And then we need to understand the departments and the budgets that each of the areas they have. And then as you grow and you become more sophisticated, then you start asking different type of questions because you have different type of problems as well.
And I think no matter who you are in the business, whether you're finance, whether you're sales, whether you're growth or marketing, whether you're product, whether you're customer success, feedback loops are very important. Like, otherwise you just keep kind of doing things on gut, or even if you think you're following data, you just end up kind of continuing the same types of things you're already doing. You need some form of feedback loop no matter what you're doing, both on an individual level and on a team level. You need to know that, oh, actually this additional add-on that we've just built, or this new feature in the product, you need some way of getting feedback on that. Like, and whether that's customers are paying for it, or whether it's speaking with customers, whether it's testimonials, you need some way of validating what you're doing, or else you'll just you're operating with blinkers, which is never a good way to be for a business. So yeah, I think it's a really good point.
Robbie, moving into the inputs and outputs, and you were saying, hey, the inputs matters because then the outputs will change. What do you think makes good forecasting? Yeah, I think that's something that were touching a little bit.
Yeah, there's probably two bits that come to mind that are really important for me. I think first of all is granularity, and not necessarily that extra granularity is always better, but it's important to be able to, if you see a number, if you see a line item, you want to kind of see that broken down to its individual components so that you can have kind of faith in what this is saying. So, like, for example, for me, if you're looking at, if you're imagining even just something like your new ARR added in a given month, you want to be able to break that down by the right granularity, whether that's maybe by segment or maybe whether that's by source that it's come from or whether it's, you know, the individual that closed it, or maybe it's even on an actual individual customer by customer level. I think that's something oftentimes that if the right granularity isn't there, it's hard to trust the forecast to a degree. And of course, it can be difficult then to actually build forecasts that do have the right granularity. Maybe it's just granularity of inputs helps you understand the kind of the overall outputs. That's kind of one. The other one is the ability to sit down and sort of say, okay, here's the forecast. I understand the forecast. I am comfortable with the forecast. Let me bring it to my CEO and let's go through this. If the CEO asks questions, and this definitely happens when you're using some tools and it can be really, really tough, the CEO might ask some really good questions or have some really good suggestions. And if you're kind of sitting there saying, oh, that's not the way I've built this, this isn't a very, like, I've built it a different way. So what you're sort of assuming is like an input for me is actually an output. So I'd have to reverse the whole direction of which I built this, or the ability to handle like, oh, well, what if like our expansion rates are actually 5% next month and not 3%? If you haven't kind of structured it in the right way, it can be very painful to do that. And ultimately, you kind of have to walk away, work on it in the background, bring it back before eventually maybe settling on a process that works. But what I'm kind of getting at is you want the right tools, like you want a tool that can handle that flexibility and can sort of make those conversations real. Because even though it is ultimately back to the same idea of like hypothesis testing and running experiments and that type of thing, particularly when it comes to forecasting and its scenarios and its different assumptions, that's a little more free flowing initially, I find. Like that's a little bit more, what if this, or what if that, or what if it's really good, or what if it's really bad? And you need a tool that can facilitate that discussion in real time. So forecasting for me, no matter what type of forecasting, whether it's like sales forecasting, pipeline forecasting, all of those things, it needs to be flexible. I think the other thing actually as well, not to maybe skip over too quickly, is your forecasts are ultimately a reflection of your understanding of the world. So if you think if you think this is the mental model we use for how we operate, and it kind of, again, without going into, everybody's different, I kind of touched on very briefly, ARR for us is broken down into new, expansion or contraction or churn. Like even just that kind of simple model, if you're going to build your forecast, if you think that's the way your business runs, build your forecast that way and see if it kind of holds up in reality. The other bit that's kind of related to that is you need to have a very good understanding of your historical performance to kind of do that. And one thing I would say would be, if you're trying to come up with assumptions, a very good starting point for your assumptions, no matter what they are, should be your historical rates over like a comparative period, if that makes sense. So if you're trying to forecast something for the next year ahead, a good starting point is, well, what was it last year? And you kind of, that's where you need to almost have that like backward looking view very clean to be able to then say, this is what I think it will be for the future. Because otherwise it's just kind of finger in the air. It's just kind of guessing these things. And that kind of defeats the point. The other thing that I would say as well, and lots of thoughts on this topic, forecasts can kind of mean different things to different people. Like forecast can be targets, or forecast can be mitigating against the worst case scenario, or forecast can be what we're sort of expecting the truth to be, or it can be all of those things. But there is nuance there. Like if you're saying, okay, it's a target versus what I think the world will be, there's probably different ways you would approach that forecast. So, and it's kind of a phrase that hopefully most people are familiar with, but the concept of like bottoms up or top down. Like if it's going to be based on kind of big assumptions about the world and about kind of, maybe it's salespeople's quotas and then it's attainment rates, that's probably going to be, well, it depends. It's probably going to be bottoms up. It's probably going to be here's our team, here's the new people we expect to add, here's their quotas, here's their attainment. Let's build a kind of sales forecast based on that. And that's good. But the other thing might be, here's the target of where we need to get to as a business. What does that mean in terms of, you know, okay, we'll take this overall figure, we'll break it down by month, we'll break it down by segment, and then it's almost like an implicit, here's how we need to get there. And those are, even though they seem quite similar, those are two very different things in my mind. So ultimately, it comes back to what questions you're trying to answer and what experiments you're trying to run, what decisions you're trying to take. But thinking those things through up front is really important, and having the tools that are flexible enough to allow you to do that.
Thank you, Robbie. That makes complete sense, because you're giving a good example where it looks like the end is the same, but the nuance of how to get there is completely different. And strategically, in the way you will forecast that will completely change. I have a question on something you were mentioning about this, that it's also one of the things we're thinking of now in the product team, which is around liquidity. You know, so when you think about, you have the money in your bank, and then all the expenses, payroll, everything you need to go and pay out, plus potentially the money that's coming in. How do you run liquidity right now? Is this something that you care about? You think about how much cash on hand we have right now so we can meet whatever liabilities that you have. Is that something you do? And if you do, when and how and why you do that?
Yeah, no, it definitely is important. I think obviously over the last year or two in particular, a lot of businesses have shifted more towards I don't want to say survival mode, but it's more about, it could manifest in a few different ways. Some companies who were prioritizing kind of growth at all costs have shifted a bit more into profitability, or starting to think about efficiency and getting towards that sooner. Other companies have been forced to kind of think about preserving runway, extending runway, that kind of that idea. Others have sort of said, we may be in a good cash position, but we can't assume that the markets are going to be there, to give us a cash, or to give us a kind of fundraising round anytime soon. So let's kind of think about other ways to not just prolong our survival, but also, have the business well positioned to allow us to do the things that we want to do. Each of those three is slightly different, but cash and liquidity and forecasting is important in each of those three in slightly different ways. And I think for sure, not only from a kind of longer term planning and a runway mentality, the other is just from a very specific day to day or month to month or week to week running of the business. It's extremely important to kind of know how much cash we're going to have and when. Treasury management is an interesting area in general for companies of all sizes, and sort of thinking about what cash do we need on hand, what proportion of our cash can we afford to lock up for a longer period of time? How do we want to actually manage the flow of cash through the business? And the best way to do that is to have a good understanding of what your obligations are going to be for the next, again, number of weeks or months. So it's extremely important. Every business probably thinks about it in a slightly different way, but cash is ultimately the kind of the lifeblood of a finance function, regardless of what you're either using it for or trying to collect it for. So yeah, would definitely recommend that companies have the appropriate level of visibility and the appropriate level of focus on cash, liquidity, and kind of forecasting for their business needs. And for some companies, depending on what their priorities are, that could be priority number one. I know some businesses for sure who are like cash, and our understanding of that are not just burn, but our actual physical kind of cash obligations are of the utmost importance to us, because for various reasons related to their business context. But it's definitely very, very important for sure.
Cool. Thank you, Robbie. And then, just to close, it's a new year, 2024. And first, I would love to know, what is the best advice you receive in your career?
The best advice I received in my career. I've definitely been very fortunate in my career at multiple different turns of being surrounded by really good people, and kind of learning from them and getting a lot of mentorship from them. Specific advice itself is kind of hard to rely on, but my advice for people in that context is try to surround yourself by people who you think are going to elevate you, people who you're going to learn from. And that might not just be specifically in your own domain. It might just be by extension, the people who are around you. Find the right fit. Be very, challenge yourself to think what it is that you're looking for, and kind of ask yourself, are the teams around me the right people to provide that? And that could be everything from, am I going to learn from them? Am I going to enjoy working with them? Am I going to, if our backs are against the wall, are these the type of people I want beside me? Or are these just the type of people that are going to energize me? I think ultimately, like, people is extremely important in the kind of work context. I think a small team of highly motivated, highly capable people can achieve like great things, more so than a larger team of kind of, maybe less motivated or less focused or less aligned people. So yeah, you're only as good as the people around you. And I think the way to make that work in practice is by being very collaborative. Both you yourself and being collaborative with the people around you. It's looking for opportunities to help people with what they're working on. It's understanding what their kind of stressors are, what their priorities are, and trying to embrace that as much as you can yourself.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think the best times I've grown has been when someone, a mentor or a friend, pointed something that it was so obvious to me that I just didn't see it, or where I was able to avoid a mistake because someone else already went through that path.
Yeah.
And when you get challenged, that's when you are like, oh my God, that is just the best feeling, when you improve yourself by someone that you just admire. So yeah, 100%, I agree. And then last but not least, yeah, 2024. What are you excited for this year, for yourself, for Humans, for
big year?
A great year. 2023 is a year for me, I think.
Yeah, 2024 is going to be a big year. Looking forward to it. Very excited. There's something very nice about the starting of a new year, and kind of obviously the recapping on what kind of came before, but also the plans and the ambitions and the energy for the year ahead. So really excited by that. Very excited by what we're doing in Humans. I think it's going to be a big year for us. 2023 was a good year. I think 2024 is going to be even better. So yeah, lots of excitement. I'm a huge NFL fan. Super Bowl is right around the corner. So that's, I always almost feel like that's my New Year's Day. So a few more weeks till that's going to be fun. But yeah, no, I don't think too much else. I think 2021, 2022, 2023 has been a very interesting kind of trajectory in startup land in general. And I think 2024, it's going to be very interesting to see what way it kind of goes. But lots to be excited about. I think the number of like new tools and solutions in the market is like really, really cool. There's a lot of interesting trends going on. There's like so many, the opportunities out there are bigger than the time I think that we all have to actually pursue them all. But there is something exciting about that too.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think 2021 was a very odd year. 2022, that's when we started the company. It was also such an odd year. They say there's never a good time to start a company, and we all went to start a company. And I would say 2023 was learnings for Payable. What is working, what is not working? How do we make sure we double down in what really matters? And then for 2024 is just focusing there on the things that really matter. Robbie, it's really nice to see you. Sucks we couldn't, make it in person. I know.
Next one for sure, Daniel. Next one for sure.
Next one, yeah, you should come over to the office.
Exactly.
And it was really lovely to have you here, Robbie.
No,
thank you so much.
Great catching up, and I'm looking forward to hearing more exciting things about Payable in the year to come.